like we might actually be on the go here. Good morning, all, or evening, or wherever you are. Welcome to Evolution Hour. We'll see whether or not we go a whole hour or not. Hard to say. Anyway, and there, of course, is r2wordpress.com. There will be a link, as always, in the video description, along with the exciting sources that we have. Hot as Haiti here is in Spokane. Got into the 90s today, although to be fair, we have relatively low humidity out here in the west. So 75 degrees with high humidity feels like what we would feel 90, 95 here. So it's a little bit more manageable. Anyway, we are continuing with our exciting, isn't that a cute little dinosaur? The Titans book. Getting close to the end of the chapter to start up with a new one. And hello, Lisa. It's also one of our Luskin weeks, so we'll have a chunk of material on that one. Spoiler alert, there's still nothing. We're over 150 sources into their listing, and there's still nothing in there that's supporting their main position, so it's just a thing. Well, that's good to know. Yes, keep on holding on to that. We also have circumstances as to whether or not Medicaid and Medicare and all these are a differential by state. That there's slightly different dynamics going on. Washington State is a more progressive state, so we're less likely to be as stupid, say, as Arkansas. 97 in Eugene, yes. Yeah, well, as I said, we have our dry heat here out in the West. Anyhow, Sarfati and Tay have a section then in this dinosaur section in one of a word that I absolutely despise. Oh, a lot of people in here. Hi there. Greetings from the other side of the ocean. Yes, indeed. Hello. Opisthotonic posture. It is one of the most hideous words I have ever encountered in the field, and it just has to refer to this bit about neck bending in the death throes a bit. And they have a little section on this. It's been a small niche in the creationist worldview to play this up, that the things when you see dinosaurs with their little necks bent back ways, that this is because of the death throes of the flood. Bum, bum, bum. And that's one fairly common refrain, and Sarfati and Tay are still playing this thing. Fortunately, they also offer some sources, which are going to be kind of fun. The first one, and last, I do not have the full text, only an abstract link that I can put in, but it's from 2007. Faux and Padian, Kevin Padian, the big dinosaur paleontologist, they were doing a paper that was disputing whether or not that neck contraction was a kind of an automatic feature of a dying animal, or whether it was related to other things. Their position was, quote, "It seems important that the opisthotonic posture has been observed extensively only in clades of animals that are known or thought to have high basal metabolic rates. Hypoxia and related diseases would be most likely to affect animals with high oxygen use rates." So, the position that they were taking, and they were discussing various examples, which also included some discussion about how they were buried. They were operating under the premise that there was fairly rapid burial involved. But since they explicitly mentioned volcanic deposits that could do that, that made Sarfati and Tay's playing of this extremely disingenuous, because they were claiming that their paper had showed the pose was, quote, "the result of having drowned in water." Nope, that was not primary position in the paper. You could indeed have examples of that, and they were arguing that, but that does not necessarily mean the big slosh, now does it? So they then, Sarfati and Tay then wanted to cite a paper that was presented at a paleontology conference, not actually a published paper, as I discovered when I tried to track it down, by Alicia Cutler et al. In 2011, and that they were favoring an immersion model, though from what I could see of it, that actually works against the flood model because of the fact that not every critter is showing this phenomenon. And if it's all due to the flood, wouldn't you expect it to be ubiquitous rather than selective? But the real zinger comes along with the 2012 paper that they brought up. which they cited only kind of peripherally. They sort of tossed it off. And it's by Reinsdorf and Wuttke, which is on evaluating the opisthotonic posture hypothesis in fossil vertebrates. Part 1, actually, although I haven't actually spotted part 2. But they're talking about reptiles and the taphonomy of the bipedal dinosaurs, Compsognathus, and a few others. So that I'll be able to put a link up to the full paper that you'll be able to go into, and you can follow it along at one's leisure. They were concluding that it wasn't an example of muscle spasms or indeed rapid burial, but a submersion issue that was occurring, which again would not require the big slosh, producing buoyancy that causes the effect, and it relates to how muscles are attached and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the real kicker is that their study went into a great deal about some examples from the Solnhofen. Rapid burial means flood confirmed. No need to think anymore. Continuous singing. Yes, that's exactly. That's the mantra that they're operating off of, without exception. But boy, they shouldn't have cited this bloody paper for it, because most of the paper is relating to the Solnhofen. That's the place where the Archaeopteryx comes from. One of the few spots where there is, in fact, Compsognathus, which is a little teeny critter. You've seen them in the second Jurassic Park movie, the little pack hunters that were flitting around. They're relatively small, long-necked critters. As I mentioned on previous episodes, the Solnhofen is a platen calc, which I will put that in the description in here. Some of them under those cute little German words that refers to these extremely fine, delicate deposits that cannot be produced except in extremely calm conditions. Exactly the opposite of the dynamics of the flood. So they're also, in this paper, they specifically note the slow rate of sedimentation involved. Again, exactly the opposite of the big slosh scenario. So they really shouldn't. Isn't that just a bog? It's not really. They can be often it relates to anoxic conditions. That was certainly the case with the Solnhofen. Basically, it's a large anoxic lake. Critters drop dead and they sink to the bottom, and they're gently deposited. There's no bacteria and things down there in this unoxygenated bottom to deal with the much. So, bingo. They can be preserved with remarkable detail. And it's no coincidence that so many of the Archaeopteryxes with their feather impressions in varying degrees of preservation all come from that one deposit, Solnhofen. Some of these other places are all similar in that respect. But Solnhofen is explicitly a platen calc. And it's a term that doesn't pop up much in the creationist literature. It's even less popular than the Lagerstätten, but nonetheless, it's highly relevant at this point. So, back to some degree, neither one of them is supporting the creationist position. And the main one, the most recent one from 2012, is blowing the creationist argument to smithereens, point by point by point, without directly doing so, simply because of the content that's what's in there. So that puts us at a very high level of technical misrepresentation, as I'm keeping track of Sarfati and Tay's material for the book. They're running at almost 2/3 of their technical citations misrepresented. And book, a big, huge chunk of the stuff is young Earth creationist postings and secondary books and that sort of stuff. But they're way higher than the 50 some odd % that I was seeing with Nathaniel Jensen and Rupin Sanford and that crowd. So they've got a record going. Whoop, great, great, great. Bad job, kids. Bad job. So part 2 this is one of episode number 31 in our ongoing series of going through the Casey Luskin list. And I had encountered this particular author, Maquat, from several of the earlier collaborative papers that have already been cited by Luskin, and we've discussed them in earlier episodes. I won't go into all the grisly details there, but they basically involve the A to I substitution issue and all that. Anyway, because I decided to check the name Maquat, Maquat, as an author, turns out there were 8 more papers that author was involved in that are on the Luskin list. So I decided together and dump them here as one big blob. And they the earliest ones are from 2011, and then there's some from 2013, a couple papers there, 2014, 2015, 2017, and the most recent one from 2020. Fortunately, every bloody one of them, I'll be able to put the linkages up for full text so everyone can follow along and find out more than what you would ever need to know. It's still working. The initial 2011 stuff is just starting to explore more and more about the whole editing process as to how the genetic systems come in and deal with particularly ALUs that clutter up our genome with million plus copies. And so they're working out the mechanisms. There's this CARM thing that's involved. Some of the things are involving human beings, but a couple of them aren't. There's a rodent example from the Wang et al. 2013 paper. And by the time we're starting to get down to 2017, as they've learned more and more and more about this, now they're to the point where they're alluding to the fact that these are mechanisms that are getting around the potential toxic side effects of having all those ALUs in the genome. And then the 2021, which was basically a Royal Society summary piece, is giving a very nice description of how these ALU signs occasionally are exploited by the human cells to some advantage. They can find ways of tinkering around them and fiddling with them. But it also means, so you have some adaptive evolution going on, but it also is implicit in the argument that the ALUs, before all of this processing happens, aren't doing anything. There are things that the system is reacting to and adapting to and modifying, which is precisely how natural evolution. So far from being a thing that is blowing to smithereens the junk DNA argument. CARM. It's an acronym for one of the little tiddly bits. Let me see whether I've got. I'd have to look up my file on the thing. Boop-a-dee-bee-bee. Let me open up my little blurb here. Of the things as ALUs are acronyms. I think it's relating to the particular molecular structure of the molecule that they're talking about. So they're only referring to it in the title of the thing as CARM. And specifically, let's see, the L. Barberi paper from 2015 is the one that you're noticing that's calming down the signs of key, 2 paths to freedom from paraspeckle dentition. That is a title alone that has a great deal of humor going. I mean, going over this off topic, Rochester news story, why don't bats get cancer? Oh, yeah, that's an interesting little feature. It'd be intriguing to know whether or not that's across the whole board. I know of at least one bat species that has a unusual telomere repair system that's very distinctive, that's unlike the typical bat. And that's why this particular species lives longer than other bats do. I'm hoping that I have the counterpart of bat telomere repair in my own genome. I don't know that that's the case, but, cross fingers, we'll see. Yeah, and I think there was a lot of a similar thing that was going on some years back as to the relative lack of or supposed lack of cancer in sharks and whether or not what kind of mechanisms and things that are going on. So there's a whole bunch of little ins and outs of how adaptive immunity works and innate immunity and how these things vary and develop and how we can look at new ways of analyzing stuff in other species to learn better about how to handle ourselves. Oh, yeah, 4 have been confirmed. So anyway, that one, the 2015 paper is the one that'll be going in specifically. There was an earlier paper that I dealt with way back in a previous episode. Protein arginine methyl transferase CARM1 attenuates the paraspeckle bit. So that you got, we'll just have CARM M1. For anybody that wants to investigate this further, probably Google that particular component. And then the other one that is the funky is paraspeckle, is the term that they use in the papers to describe this kind of stuff. So whenever they're dealing with a weird detail, they have to come up with a term for it. So somebody has a good sense of humor. I'm not entirely sure why they picked the speckle part, unless it was a matter that it was a little sub-trim component of something else. Been a while since I've read some of the other material on this. But at any rate, all of that would be a thing that you can follow through, because the papers are all full access. And so you can, by progressing through them chronologically, you get a little different perspective than the way they are doing in the Luskin them in no particular order. Whereas you can see there's a progressive development of they're trying to figure out what the hell is the problem, and then gradually working things out and solving issues and finally understanding more and more and more about it. Nobody's arguing that a proportion of ALUs do things, and some of them are directly functional in the case of the brain, and other things become interacted with primarily because of the fact that those ALUs can plug in like little Lego blocks and nest one with another and cause the DNA to coil around, which, as I pointed out in some earlier episodes, is one of the reasons why we anthropoid primates don't have tails, because it's that ALU lockage that has disconnected a section of genome that normally would be producing tails in primates. And it has an unpleasant side effect, because it can trigger off diseases, because that same gene in other contexts, in other parts of the genome, has deleterious effects. So you have a whole mechanism of stuff that's using ALUs as markers on the genome. There's so many of them. If you have a system that adapts to where it can spot ALUs, well, gosh, anywhere there's an ALU can be located. And if you need to edit them out of the system by introns or any of these other procedures, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The fact that it's taken decades to gradually piece together what all of these little components are, and that none of this work, as far as I can see, is being done by anybody in the intelligent design movement, or for that matter, in the regular creation movement, it's wheel spinning par excellence. So you'll have a couple new words, CARM1 and paraspeckle. The terminology is something that, as a general technique, you can often find out additional sidebar information by looking up the terminology, by looking up the little sidebar details like that to get a perspective on stuff. Whereas often you'll find the case that the creationists will just be riffing off of the material, and they won't bother to think about what the terms mean and what are they referring to and how is this connecting up with other people's research. So it's a constant ongoing process of delving into the technical literature. Name derived from the distribution in the nucleus. Thank you. There we go. Bravo. Thank you, Brian. Para question, so for parallel, and the speckle refers to the splicing speckles for which they are always in close proximity. Bravo. There we go. And the very fact that there's such a barrage of technical terminology in this area, in any discipline, I've been finding out the same situation in relation to a cosmological chapter that I'm working on, just finishing up star formation material so that I can get on to solar system development, where I'm discovering hell big Harrow ejections and a whole bunch of little fiddly bits in regards to axions and subatomic particles and all this kind of stuff that's popping up in all these different contexts. And it's then fun to follow through how these issues get loose ends. Like one that I just stumbled on a few days ago, Kirkwood gaps in the asteroid belt that will be coming up in the section in dealing with, well, asteroid belt and comets and meteors and all that stuff. The creationists kind of wiffle waffle around. But it's Kirkwood gaps are spacers, kind of lines and things in the Saturn's rings, where there are sort of holes and gaps in the asteroid belt. And why is that? Well, it's because you got some big gravitational players, mainly Jupiter, but also to some extent Saturn, that kind of clean the things out because of resonance factors. And there's a whole little technical literature on that. And I stumbled on it quite inadvertently because one of the little older notes that I had, which, by the way, happens to be gone from the internet. If I hadn't have had a hard copy printout from like 2011 or so, I wouldn't have had any information on it. But a conservative Christian scientist was attending a creationist conference or church meet that Jason Lyle was lecturing at. I think it was Lyle. And it was that this Christian specifically in the Q&A section after the talk brought up these Kirkwood gaps to Lyle, and Lyle kind of just sloughed them off. And what was intriguing is that I realized I didn't really have anything on this in my main reference bibliography, and that's because it hadn't been brought up. And so it doesn't get alluded to much. And the very absence of that topic, I did some searches to find out if anybody at AIG or ICR or CMIs dealt with the thing, and whoops, they kind of skipping it. So whether or not there's any little sidebar information buried in the material that I have on the whole asteroid meteor formation stuff, there's a big stack of that I still have to process when I get down to that section of the chapter. I'll see whether or not there's any further allusions to all of that. Thank you for, oh yes, everybody pay attention to the direct link on that little puppy, so anybody may follow up as they will. It's so it's a constant ongoing thing. I would have to say the most intimidating section of the work that I've ever had to tackle is the cosmology stuff, because I'm not an astronomer, although I know people who are, build their own telescopes and have expertise in those areas. But and as well, I followed the area reasonably well as an informed layman, knowing about the Big Bang and galactic expansion and solar system formation and all that from general interest. But to get into the weeds about when they're talking about creationists are going on about blue giant stars and the spiral arm formation and all of that, turns out there's an awful lot of material going on, and also a tremendous tendency to kind of move the goalposts as they jump from one thing to another. Hello, Vesta. One of the things that I think will be a fun historical bit is how certain topics get really focused on for a while, and then everything falls apart on it, and it ceases to be a major factor, like the shrinking sun argument that Kent Hovind still trots out presently, but he's very much an outlier. But that means that how far removed from the data field, from the creationist side, do you have to be to continue to be repeating stuff like this? So is it a matter that they are just digging their heels in and refuse to pay any attention to even creationist criticism of it? Or do they not know about this material and they're simply riffing off of really old creationist apologetics where the issue was still a current one? Sorting all of that material out, I was just watching a Dapper Dino video where along the way, the Oklo natural reactor came up, and someone was asking in the live chat about how many creationists have tried to pay any attention to the Oklo natural reactor. And bless his heart, Dapper said, well, I don't know. I wonder if RJ would know something about that. Well, ask and ye shall receive. So I put a comment in there. I put the whole draft text of the info box that we're having on the Oklo reactor, because we had gone into that very issue where we're listing off everyone that we can find in the creationist community that's kind of mentioned the Oklo reactor. And it's not a hell of a lot. It's less than a handful who have bumped into the thing. And most of the time, they're not paying attention to it at all. Oh, how is Canada? Well, not the United States, thank heavens. We're seeing how things can run on. Supposedly, the God King Emperor Trump is going to try to put some more tariffs on there, and in this on again, off again, on again, off again, on again, off again thing. Enjoy it during the summer, kids. We'll see how the crash is going. Yeah, YECs aren't big on research. Yeah. One of the things that I do discover, you do have curious little cross exceptions to things. There's only a handful of the young Earth creationists who are really dynamic players on the creationist side in cosmology. John Hartnett, Jason Lyle, Danny Faulkner, and on the fossilized side, Russ Humphreys, and a few other little hangers on. And a few of them, Danny Faulkner in particular, still publishes technical papers, kind of sidebar stuff, and some of it's co-authored with another young Earth creationist astronomer that aren't pushing explicitly a young Earth creationist position, and so they're in sidebar journals, but not creationist journals. And that Faulkner was really quite a surprise as to how long he'd been doing this. Their papers going back to the 1980s and then all the way down to like 2019 was one of the most recent collaborative stuff. Whereas others seem to be much thinner. A little bit of stuff from Josh Hartnett, a little bit of stuff from Jason Lyle, but not a stampede. Over here, the government handed in their resignation to the king a few weeks ago after about a year of incompetent bumbling and infighting. Ah, yes, we have to hand our resignations to. Instead, we have somebody trying to make himself into a king. Don't blame me. I voted for Harris, so not of my concern. So let me put my thank you note here for our patrons. At least I eliminated some of the weird drop off. Whatever it is that Word is doing on this laptop, it won't correct it, and regardless of the original file, got about halfway. Everybody who continues to everybody's got to make sure that they're that, and hopefully it will be correct. Yeah, there I'm at. There we go. Yes. It must be hours in the morning or early or late morning, 8, 9, 10, 11 hours ahead, something like that. Don't know whether they do daylight savings time in Europe or not. Hold on here. We have one state in the United States, Arizona, that doesn't go on daylight savings. And then Idaho is the screwball one because the northern part of the state is in West Coast Pacific time, and the southern part of the state is in Mountain time. So if you drive north to south, suddenly you jump into a different time zone, which I had trouble when I realized, oh God, by the time I arrived there, everything is closed. Yelling they didn't vote for this. Yes, they did. Oh yeah, that's I think is the most blatant, absurd hypocrisy of people that what they really mean to say is they paid so little attention to what the Trumpistas were promising to do that they're shocked, in the same way that so many of the ones that 10 a.m. There we go. That the Trumpistas like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who didn't really read through the whole thing. Well, maybe you shouldn't have bills so monstrous that you can't read through them. But again, this has been a trick that's been going on in politics for a long time. The Trumpistas certainly didn't invent it. But the idea is that you ram a bunch of things together in such a way that you can generate enough interest to support it, even though bits and pieces of it are horrifying to some of the people voting for it, but they need the other things, so they'll go ahead and do it. That's part of the ways juggling acts go on in reconciliation with the Senate and all of that. But I personally prefer the idea of specialized single topic bills that are tidy and neat, and you're voting up or down on this or that. That I think we will need to have a considerable reform in our politics to maneuver around that. And I don't think we will see much reform in that department so long as the idiot Trumpistas are playing such a big role as we have. And then we want to see that party disappear I won't even call them Republicans anymore. I remember what Republicans look like. Let's not insult Lincoln any further by referring to them as that. They're Trumpistas. It's a personality cult. As some people have pointed out demographically, for young people who haven't yet reached voting age, literally, Donald Trump is the Republican Party to them. They've never known anybody other than him because he was really starting to dominate the show 2016. That's 9 years ago. So you have to be well enough past college age to even remember peripherally a pre-Donald Trump GOP. And for those of us who definitely remember the pre-GOP and all the way back into its foundations in the 19th century, this ain't the GOP. It's extinct. Hello, yes, hello, Purple. Right about Alexander de Croo is context for, oh, I'm not sure of that one. Yeah, if anybody wants to fill me in on that, I have no clue who that is. A politician in one of these countries. It's very, I kind of catch up peripherally on some of the stuff because we get on our public television channel material from Deutsche Woche from Germany and Asian Insights from Japan. And there's also material from Poland, and there's a whole bunch of international things that pop up in little sidebar stuff so that you get a little bit broader issue. And then there's material from the BBC that there's a much more international material in there. So I don't have to depend quite so much. Trump is handing out tariffs like a fool. Carney is busy signing contracts with the world. Yeah, one of the things that's going to be very interesting to see, especially if my dire predictions for the collapse of the United States economy turn out to be correct and we slide into a depression, is the extent to which both the European Union and the British Commonwealth get together and deal with trade agreements independent of the United States so that they can weather the storm. We don't have the disconnected European situation that we had after World War I that helped grease the skids for Hitler. And you have, frankly, even if you see the European Union and some of these areas as less efficient economically as the old Biden economy was, comparatively, if they weather the storm better than we do, then that puts them in a dominant position. The European Union on its own has 450 million people in it, which is as much as the United States and Russia combined. Throw in Ukraine and throw in Britain and the Commonwealth connections. That's a big economic powerhouse. So we'll be seeing what's going on here. Better to get news about the U.S. from outside the country. Wise policy. Well, NPR, we have a public television and public radio is still very balanced and meticulous. And so, and our local PBS channels here are in partnership with Canada. So we have a big cross connection with Edmonton and Calgary here, and something of the same type happens over on the the wet side of the state in Seattle, but very much so in this neck of the woods. So our local PBS system acts as a network that spills across the border into Canada, and we have such a tight trade connections and people going back and forth in so many different directions here. That's it's just built into our culture here, and I don't anticipate that changing no matter what idiots in Washington, D.C. do. So anyway, yes, the entire regime are idiots. We're currently seeing the absolute screwball devouring their own bit as the extreme MAGA people who were screaming bloody murder about the Epstein files are now screaming bloody murder because apparently the Trump administration and Attorney General Bondi wants to just say, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. Just go away. Nothing at all. No Epstein list at all. Probably because Trump and quite a few other people are very knee-deep in this. There's some indications that Steve Bannon may be connected up in this stuff. And so they would have every reason not to be able to reveal all this stuff. But the problem is that the extremists, Kash Patel and Bongino, made their careers on this stuff. How can they possibly turn off the spigot of outrage? So it's going to be intriguing to see for the next few months in that. And then when we hit the fall and presumably our great crash, then we'll be in an entirely different environment in terms of, no, the Trump economy is not doing all that well, no matter what Mr. Trump announces. So let me put my little advert up for Rocks Were There Volume 1. We are a little past more than nothing in the show. Come on, slow. There we go. Maybe the little electrons are becoming tired here in the heat. That's entirely possible. I'll be glad to see if the temperature cools down a bit, but at least we do not have high humidity. Holy moly, it would be hell on a bike if we had high humidity and 90 degrees. Volume 1, we're very proud of. We did meticulous research on it. And Volume 2 will be better. Zingy, up to date, wonderful stuff. Holy moly, we have a lot of fun writing all this material. Compendium of the science facts, as well as a compendium of how creationists of all stripes, from mainly the younger creationists, but we don't leave the intelligent design crowd out, that it will be a good guide to who the players are and what they've said and when and why they're wrong, and why the science data is what it is and why it's neat. And also the sheer enthusiasm for how just splendidly wonderful this is in terms of how much neat stuff is going on. Minnesota PBS is well-funded. Twin Cities, highest donor viewer ratios in the country. Yeah, you have, even with, when you think about, the proportions of things, that most of the public radio and television resources are not federal money. It's a big chunk, but it's not the majority. The problem will come for a lot of these local areas, rural areas, ironically in red states, where it's some of their best sources of independent information. And if they lose some of these locations, networking for local disaster alerts and stuff that have gone through the public radio transmitter stations and the like, there's going to be downsides all up and down the yin-yang. Spokane here in eastern Washington has a fairly good mix of things. We're looking over the border into Crazy Train, Idaho. So there are people that come over here for benefits of a variety of types, and we'll see how things are going. If there's a God, I would have to call it incompetent design. Yes. Idea is just creationism rebranded. I call it creationism light in my old tip work, that material in that website that's up on there. All the ideology, but even less fact. It's literally so, in the sense that intelligent design is very restricted in what it brings up. It deals with origins or bust stuff, so they're obsessing about the Cambrian explosion and the origin of life. They vaguely go on and on about information, so all of those are topics that have their counterparts in young Earth creationism. But so much of the other material, they as we'll be pointing out in the new book, that the fine-tuning, cosmological fine-tuning argument is much more likely to be presented from an intelligent design perspective than it is from a young Earth creationist perspective, because big chunks of that cosmological fine-tuning argument connect up with standard physics and astrophysics, which means the chronology and all the other stuff that they would kind of avoid. Now, fine-tuning for, the Earth is just the right distance from the sun, blah, blah, blah. That's been a trope that's been in young Earth creationism from the Henry Morris days. But that cosmological angle is much more restricted. And as soon as I started looking in detail as to who was saying what when about it, that really came out as really quite an intriguing little differentiation. They also home to a dozen Fortune 500. Yes, indeed. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of underlying components that are going on in the economic world. Just like Trump may hate windmills, but one of the biggest states for windmill installations is Texas. Kansas is another one. The ginormous wind farms up in the middle of the state where there's this big escarpment where the distant altitude near mile high on one side, and then it drops down thousands of feet for the eastern side of the state. It performs a lot of the same role that we have here when you're going up the Columbia Gorge and you're going up on the escarpments. There's all the wind farms on a much smaller scale than what I was seeing in Kansas, as you're going up towards Ellensburg and that in the middle of the state. And that's just thermodynamics and physics. And whether Trump hates them, he hates the idea. He was opposed to that wind farm in out on offshore in Scotland because you could see it from his golf course. Oh boy, boo-hoo. Sheesh. I personally find the big wind farms rather beautiful. I think they're extraordinary. And the little whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the things. I'm not living right underneath one. And I have not seen any indication that there's vast amounts of dead birds and bats, which Trump has as part of his little trope that he keeps repeating about it. Oh, cosmological fine-tuning. Yeah. It's the feature, particularly in the privileged planet. I'll show you the little draft of the chart. I keep that handy. What's getting fine-tuned? We've trimmed it down to 10 major components that are covered by not everybody in the field. They each kind of focused on a little different stuff. Neutron mass, carbon alpha resonance, Higgs mass potential, fusion efficiency, the fine structure constant, density parameter, the tomb ray stability, the electromagnetic versus gravity ratio, proton to electron ratio, and the cosmological constant. That's kind of related to dark energy. And where, yes, it's the closest thing to being Canadian, but even the accent, well, Minnesotans have an often similar accent to what you get up in Canada, though, with the A's and all that stuff you see in Fargo and that whole Midwestern drawl area. Anyway, back to fine-tuning. The trope on these things is that they're on like a razor's edge, like thousandth of a percent either way. There would be disasters, dogs and cats living together, planets couldn't form, stars wouldn't function, etc., etc. Now, if you take any one of the constants of the universe and vary it enough, assuming nothing else changed, by definition, there would be an effect. If, for example, gravity were much weaker, stars couldn't form under certain circumstances. If it was super strong, they would implode into black holes. So yes, there's obviously a parameter involved. But as it turns out, what really amazed me is when we delved into the exact numbers of how much these things can vary. Not one of them is as finely tuned as the tropes indicate. And at least 3 of them, so almost a third, of the big 10 that we'll be discussing, there's some indication that they have in fact varied somewhat over the history of the universe, particularly in the early part of the universe. So how fine-tuned can something be if it can vary even in the natural universe? So the cosmological fine-tuning argument, frankly, is much less tenable now than it was when it was being hit with a vengeance. It started up in the 1980s and really got going again with the Privileged Planet book that came out in 2004. In fact, they just issued the 20th anniversary of it last year. One of the co-authors, Jay Richards, was blathering on about it on a channel with, I think, Frank Turek. And we'll be, in fact, quoting some of the stuff from that interview where it's clear Jay Richards has all the culture camp sensibilities. He's obsessed about trans people. He's connected up with the Heritage Foundation, the Project 25 bunch. None of this will be a shock to anybody that follows the culture camp superstructure of that anti-evolution movement. Moved to New York, living in Minnesota. The accent's so strong, everybody thought I was from Canada. Yeah, that wouldn't be surprising at all. Although the difference in humidity from New York to Minnesota is relatively trivial, so it's still humid. Whereas I'm glad to be out in our comparatively dry as a bone Washington state. And we had something of an advantage because of the fact that so much of our agriculture in our big Columbia River system is water that's pumped in from the river. rather than having to depend entirely on rainfall. So that means that we can do stuff that works really nice in a fairly dry climate, like wines. We're a major wine producing region now. And of course, there'll be some other areas with climate change that will, God, Britain will get warm enough that they can resume their big wine industry the way they used to have in the Middle Ages. Sun of the Earth varies by a couple million miles due to its elliptical orbit. Yes, that's another little thing where sometimes you'll find bottom level creationists who will be arguing that if the Earth varied even the teeniest bit from its orbit, well, it does vary by millions of miles. And it wobbles around. That's one of the reasons why the precession of the equinoxes and all that other stuff. So it's really hilarious. Or try telling that to a young Earth creationist. Yeah. Oh, you get some of that fine tuning position of the planet stuff from intelligent design people too. So it's not, and old Earth creationism too. Ross Brand will fall into that. So it's a fairly common trope that pops up. It's worthless crap when you start looking at the details. In fact, one of the big surprises of cosmology over the last, really 20 years, within this century mainly, is the realization that some of the planets have moved around. Mercury was formed much farther out from the sun than it currently is. Jupiter was formed much farther out from where it is, and it started moving in and would probably have devoured all of the inner planets. Had Saturn not developed as well and slowed it down, clears away sections of the asteroid belt and all of that. So there's been an awful lot of stuff going on over the billions of years of our system before we kind of settle down into the fairly stable operation that we have now. And of course, the one of the distinctive features about our solar system that not totally rare, but not dime a dozen either, is the fact that we have an extremely large Jupiter. So one of these standard size gas giant planets, Uranus, Neptune, that sort of thing, are much smaller than Saturn, and that's quite a bit smaller than Jupiter. So that Jupiter class, which is getting to the point where it's almost enough to become like a failed star, that's a very different dynamic in a solar system than you get when you don't have that in the formation. Yes, that's a perfectly fine point. In fact, there's still some discussion as to how much water and things that were going on in the early planets before they fizzled out or not. It's been hypothesized that if Mars was where Venus is and Venus is where Mars is, they would have turned out very differently, because Mars is kind of small and far enough out that it really couldn't develop life in much of a way. And then Venus is somewhat too close and turned into hell house of the solar system with its runaway greenhouse effect. And so it's an interesting, fascinating issue. There's the whole issue about the role that plate tectonics plays in things, that you have to have a certain amount of size to be able to generate a plate tectonic modality. And that in our case, because it churns up the environment, chunking up former pieces of real estate and spitting up new material and throwing stuff out, that's probably played a not trivial role in how life has developed the way that it has. So, say something about Saturn's rings. Ooh, yes. That's been a major development once we started sending detailed probes out there, because before all you could look at were by telescopes. But once you had Cassini mission, which is named for the Cassini rings that are in the Saturn's rings system, they form big bands look like record grooves. Virtually all of the gas giants have a ring system of some form or another, and it's very probably due to a captured moon that just disintegrates when it gets into the Roche limit. And so they're relatively thin ones on Uranus and Neptune. Saturn is ginormous, spectacular. Jupiter probably doesn't really form a ring system so easily because it chews everything up too fast. So Saturn is kind of probably the right size for a while. The ring system that you see now won't have been there forever. And in fact, that's one of the things the young Earth creationists go berserk on, is they would go, the ring system is not billions of years old. No astronomer thinks they're billions of years old. There are all sorts of features that are temporary. The big red spot on Jupiter is a mega hurricane. Probably wasn't there 100 million years ago, and probably won't be there a million years from now. Enjoy it while you can, kids. Mars gravity isn't strong enough to hold an atmosphere that will keep liquid water on the surface. Yes, indeed. In fact, Mars is so bone dry that it's a murky little place to deal with. So although there is a lot of certainly good circumstantial evidence that there was liquid water present in the early stages of Mars, it quickly fizzled out. And the idea whether any living biosphere could have Gaia'd their way around it and compensated for it, experiment, curious idea, but going by the Mars we can see, no. So that's why it'd be still fun to send scientists to Mars to be able to poke around to find out not whether there's any life there now. It would be amazing if so, but I'm not holding my breath. But whether life may have started there and fizzled out. So there you need to be able to look at fossil information and the like that you really can't do from the remote control stuff that we can send here. You actually have to send science teams to poke around in that area. Likewise, we've got Europa and some of these other large moons of some of the gas giants that have internal heating. There's apparently some kind of a liquidy ocean in Europa underneath its ice caps. Could there be living systems there? We're hoping to send probes there in due course. If I can make sure I've got my bat telomere repair system going in my genome, maybe I'll live long enough to see it. So there we go. Yes, there's an awful lot of things for the same reason that you've got the difference between the prejudicial side of things on the Idaho border versus yes, indeed. Yes, that one's a very recent development about the, I think during the Ordovician period. Whoops, keep on trying to hit my little thing and getting rid of that. There we go. I think the paper just came out either this year or last year on a series of craters that, when you think about how they were formed, it looks suspiciously like a big asteroidal system had broken up, and gradually they're going blup, 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 and getting pulled down and slammed into the earth. And when you do the modeling of what that would have been forming before it got slamming into the earth, that it's very probable that it would have formed a ring. So there would have been a temporary ring if there had been any little spacefarers knocking around during the Ordovician, where there was really not much above waterline to have taken a look at it. We would have had a little bit of a thin ring at that time, and gradually it disintegrates, pieces fall apart, they hit the earth, burn up in the atmosphere, boop, gone. And so anything like that, you can have. Well, another great revolution in astronomy was realizing just how many bloody moons all those gas giants have. So the lists that would have been the case in an encyclopedia in 1958, wow, they were really underestimating. So the vast majority of the moons that we now know are orbiting Saturn, particularly, and Jupiter, weren't known until we sent probes out there to look close, because a lot of them are little teeny dinky little things. Then, of course, you got all of the stuff that's farther out in the solar system that has changed the reason why we don't consider Pluto a planet anymore, because if you're going to go by the size of something as dumpy as Pluto, well, there's a whole bunch of other ones that are in the same ballpark, so you have to add on those. Maybe let's just call them protoplanets or quasi-planets or something like that. Well, you had a big chunk of it is from the big heavy bombardment period. And so they're interesting fossil record functionally of all of the different elements that are going on. One of the reasons why they suspect that Mercury wasn't formed where it was has to do with how heavily cratered it is and how certain of them are survived over a long period of time. There's a whole bunch of little things about how they've worked out what temperature needed to make certain features as opposed to what we're seeing during the cratering process and all that. So it's an intriguing detective story piecing all together. And that means that if anybody, creationist or not, that's trying to rely on astrophysics, cosmological material that isn't from our century is probably wasting their time. So although they would have been perfectly accurate books of the time, holy smokes, a work from 1990 or 2000 is just too far behind the curve to rely on for any line in the sand kind of stuff. So anyway, oh yes, Jupiter. Yikes, I'm trying to think of what the current count is now, whether it's 30, 40, or however many. And every once in a while, they find some little teeny new moonlet popping along. Not at all implausible to imagine that additional ones may be collected and add in at some point, especially if we're talking about over the next few centuries. It could easily acquire some more. Jupiter is a monster maw that chews up everything around it. And as I said, if it hadn't been for Saturn slowing it down, it would have devoured everything in the inner solar system. We wouldn't be here talking if that had been the case. Oh yes, it was the formation of the moon was one of the big things where both of the main models were wrong. Back in, come on, here we go. Sometimes this thing hits very, very persnickety as to how, since I don't have a mouse, I have to use that little finger pad, and I hate that little monster. Anyway, back when I was a young'un, you had two competing models of how the moon was formed. One is that it was a captured satellite. The other was that it was formed in the same big nebula that the Earth was, and it congealed functionally at the same time. It only within, by the 1980s, a differing approach was done, and in part because they had moon samples to look at. And they discovered that the moon was made from very specific balances that made sense if it were formed from a chunk of the Earth that had gotten blobbed off. And I think they tend to call it Theia, that was probably around the size of Mars, that slammed into the early forming Earth, blasted a bunch of gunk out of it, obliterated Theia completely, and churned around to where we left over with this relatively large moon relative to the size of the Earth, quite close, orbiting very, very near. Would have been mega tides, much bigger. The Earth would have been rotating much, much faster than it does now, which would mean if it had some a magnetic field that would be more intense. There's a whole bunch of little variables that they're still trying to piece together the implications, especially in the early forming of life. Once the heavy bombardment ends, you have a different dynamic. The moon is still close enough to the Earth that it has much heavier tides. And we knew the moon is receding from the Earth, so there was kind of a ballpark figure as to how old the system could be just by working out backwards from the lunar recession rate. But the impact event in a collision is a little different than just a blob that's then spreading outwards or a captured satellite spreading outwards. And so the dynamics of working that out is quite a bit different. So that works out a different thing as to how the dating on the earliest phases of the moon's formation, which is, I think it was like 4.2, something like that. It's very early in the process. The Earth is mostly to its present mass, and then it gets slammed into by a Mars-sized object, which remember how relatively small a Mars-sized thing is, and it's enough that some of the stuff ends up in the Earth's crust, some of its stuff ends up as the moon, some of it's probably ejected and thrown off. There may have been ringlets and things going on that have disappeared since. It's hard to say. Capture with another moon, and they collided way back when leaving one. I haven't heard that model yet. There's still people that tinker with the things because there's all sorts of complex stuff when you're trying to work that far back to where all you have is the current system. If you're leaving anything out, away we go. There was discussions about how heavy an impact, how much of the mixtures are being done, but a lot of it does have to do with the presence of oxygen-bearing rocks, which can only form in certain contexts, and the depletion as heavy iron stuff sinks into the planet. So if you're slamming into where you're getting relatively lightweight material formed from the moon, as opposed to stuff that should have about the same balance, if it was being formed in a nebular hypothesis or a captured satellite. We do know that because we have such a relatively large moon, it's had enormous effects on tides, stabilizing the Earth's orbit's axis, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on that Isaac Asimov was pointing out way long ago, 1960s. I remember reading about that. So anyway, So we are, wow, got a whole hour out of the way, and we put our little advert on for the book. Everybody stay super duper safe during the next bits. If you're in a heaty area, you've got the heat dome out here in the west. You've got potential flash floods still going on in Texas. You've got storm systems up the yin yang and tornadoes and all the other stuff, plus ice and all the other lunacies coming from the nutballs in the Trump administration. And it's an exciting world that we're living in. We're going to give the 1920s and 1930s a run for their money, aren't we? Well, let's try to play out that game differently than we did the last time, because that really was effed up. So keep an eye out for the dangerous wooden penguins, and we will be seeing all you kids next week. And in 2 weeks, we will have another Luskin show. Yay. Au revoir.